and welcome to Profit Insights. I'm Vikram Oza in our Mumbai studio, and today we're getting insights from London. Professor Ranjay Gulati is joining us from there. He's a professor at the Harvard Business School, an expert on leadership and strategy and organizational growth. And he's here to speak about his newly launched book, something that I've been reading. It's called How to Be Bold, The Surprising Science of Everyday Courage. And it's rather interesting, this book, because for most of us, when we hear the word bold, in the business context at least, what comes to mind is perhaps that one person who storms the boardroom, or the daring startup founder who's jumping into uncharted territory, or even the corporate leader who is making a grand bet. But here, Professor Gulati's book is far wider in its scope. Here we're asking, what if boldness is not just for the audacious few? What if it's something you can build yourself, you can practice even in everyday work? And that's the core of Professor Gulati's argument in this book. In fact, he sets out a playbook of the letter C, things like coping and confidence and connection and commitment. This is for individuals. Then there are the other set of C's, which are probably would hold true for a group, and that's clan and charisma and culture. So in this conversation, we'll look at how Professor Gulati's framework plays out in the context of India's corporate world, its startups, national reforms, also for employees at every level. So absolutely delighted to welcome you, Professor Gulati, from London to NDTV Profit. It's wonderful to have you with us, and a very warm welcome to Profit Insights.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm delighted to be here.
So let's dig in, Professor. Typically, a lot of us have grown up romanticizing boldness. We hear lines like, "Himmat-e-marda to madad-e-khuda," or like marketing lines that become ingrained in our popular culture, like "Dar ke aage jeet hai." And the list goes on. But you open your book by saying that people often assume that courage is innate. You either have it or you don't, but you're arguing that it is learnable. Explain that to us.
Absolutely. And this is central to the argument of this book, actually. I myself was guilty of falling into the stereotypes of Hollywood and Bollywood, and even fiction, modern day fiction, which really lays out this idea that, courage is the absence of fear, first of all. If you look at James Bond, Jason Bourne, all the characters that are put forward, they don't express fear in any way, shape, form, or the other. And so you look at Sholay or any of these movies, these are the daredevils who don't experience fear. So the first realization I had was courage is not the absence of fear, but is taking action in the face of fear. Even Nelson Mandela talked about this as well. Then the question is, can you actually become or cultivate courage? And again, if you look at, just anecdotally look at history, many of these characters who've done amazing things were not born courageous, they became courageous. If you look at the arc of their trajectory over time, they actually cultivated and became courageous over time. And there was early research on this as well, done on bomb disposal squads and paratroopers in the British Army during World War II. So all this led me into the segue that maybe courage is learned behavior. I also saw this in organizations, by the way. Companies were looking at turnarounds and transformations where companies had lost their mojo, as we say, and how they built back this collective courage. So that was the starting point for this project, that courage is not the absence of fear, nor are you born courageous, you can become courageous, but how?
So how being that question, if I were to bring in the Indian context over here and take, for example, a medium-sized family-run manufacturing business in, say, a tier 2 city in India, where the challenges are several. There is global competition, there are labor rigidities, there is a regulatory overload as well, perhaps weak digital capabilities as well. What would you find as the biggest barrier that prevents that leader who heads an organization of that nature from being bold? And if you had to pick your first C for him or her, which C would it be?
So, excellent question. Both for startups and mid-sized companies, I found fascinating. Very quickly, companies which have been achieved early success fall into what I call the success trap. The success trap means that now you have something to lose. So you go into, from playing offense, you start to play defense. Instead of playing to win, as we say in sports, you play not to lose. Hold on to what we have, protect. And there's a Nobel Prize in economics for this, loss aversion, which is that the human brain experiences the pain of losing more than the joys of winning. So here we are protecting what we have instead of trying to win and go for new opportunities. Are we willing to then lean into that? So the first obstacle is ourselves, because as we scale, we we got this mindset of defense, hold what I have. And second is, as we scale the organization, we want to create consistency and accountability. So in this accountability desire, everyone has results orientation, deliver to the quarter, but we've lost the capacity to take risk and make mistakes, learn, and you wouldn't even call them mistakes, they're experiments. So accountability crowds out experimentation. So as a result, we go into this don't rock the boat mode, and you end up with an organization that becomes complacent, stagnant, and focused on holding on to what it has.
But it's very interesting. You started off by saying that, this applies to organizations, the kind that I mentioned, a mid-sized organization in a tier 2 city in India, as much as it does to a startup. But startups is where, in that ecosystem, you're only willing to rock the boat in the initial stages at least. You have founders, they're navigating several regulatory gray zones. There is the big overhang of funding, whether you're going to get it or not, whether it will be enough or not. And the need is to scale from, say, 10 to 1,000 employees. You are building category in India, and that's always going to be a tough task, and maybe even scale abroad. That could be the far-off dream. So how does this confidence, the sea of confidence, apply over here, especially when you're charting new territory? You don't have all the data that supports your aspirations. And how do you build confidence in the face of so many unknowns than, waiting for perfect clarity on making some of those bold moves that you need to as head of a startup?
So let me pick on two, confidence and comprehension. So confidence comes from research actually done by a Stanford psychologist named Albert Bandura. And Bandura actually was interested in taking kids who were terrified of snakes and trying to see if he could teach them to hold a snake. So he put an ad in the paper, and he found some students who were willing to come for money, and they had self-identified as ophidiophobes, terrified of snakes, meaning they can't even look at a snake. And he was going to train them to hold and touch and hold a large corn snake. Corn snakes are 6 feet long. They look scary, but they don't bite. So he told them that, but none of them wanted to even see the snake. Over the course of several weeks, half the students dropped out. The other half actually somehow were able to do it. Now, you might call it sensitization, exposure, training, familiarity, and somehow he managed to get them to do it. But that's irrelevant, actually. What is interesting is at the end of the study, after the study is over, these kids reported heightened senses of what he called self-efficacy. I can do anything. If I can touch a snake, which I was terrified of, I can do anything. This self-efficacy is what I call the can-do mindset or confidence. And this is what people cultivate. You see this in some entrepreneurs, not all.
Right.
Where they build this confidence up, where it's not confidence only, it's can-do. So that's the first piece of it. The other one is comprehension. Most of us have a tendency to take action after we've gathered all the data, knowing before doing. Well, it turns out in heightened situations of uncertainty where we don't know what's going to happen, like in the case of AI today or tariffs today and supply chain disruptions today, where we don't know, the human tendency is to freeze and wait.
Yes.
Sometimes you have to act your way into knowing. You have to take small steps into the darkness in order to learn so you can update and revise your point of view. So that's comprehension. It's ancient mariners used to do this. Point-to-point navigation. They would take small steps into the ocean, further steps and further steps. So you realize that people are resourcing themselves. This is not reckless behavior. This is not James Bond jumping out of a plane without a parachute.
Yes.
This is very thoughtful ways to build up the muscle.
Correct.
To be able to take bold action.
Right. And there is a step-by-step approach to comprehension. But since you're talking about, how we get inundated, there is so much flying around, especially when you talk about AI. So I want to bring it down to everyday employees in India. You think of a mid-level manager, Professor, someone who works in a large Indian IT services firm, or perhaps even a bank for that matter, or even, say, an auto component supplier. Maybe they notice a process inefficiency, or maybe there is a client escalation that keeps recurring. They feel stuck because the culture may say, don't rock the boat, something you were hinting at. Now, how does one apply that theory of connection, comprehension, even micro-action ideas to trigger change from that level? What's a practical move for someone with, limited power in the hierarchy?
So first of all, speaking truth to power is hard at all levels,
It is.
as we can find, right?
It is.
So, and it has consequences. So let's also be very clear. Courage, being bold, doesn't in some way protect you from the consequences of courageous action. And I think is in these instances, there are two thoughts I want to share with you. One, I talk about as having conviction. What do you believe in? I think great leaders from very young age have a strong sense of purpose and an anchor about what are their fundamental beliefs that they believe in. And people ultimately will respect them for that. They may be called transparent, authentic, whatever later on, but I think having conviction also gives you your own self the courage to do what you need to do. That's the first one. The second one I think is important to understand is connection, which is support. Courage doesn't happen in isolation. I looked at Frances Haugen, one of my former MBA students, who was the whistleblower actually at Facebook. She took 1 year before she decided to escalate the issue that she had information on that Facebook was hiding. And she did it because she had the support, what I call connection. And these support came in the form of moral support. It came in the form of information support. It came in the form of resource support. And it came in the form of feedback support. She had different people giving her the support system. So if you want to act boldly, build your support system around you. Who's helping you with information? Who's helping you get access to valuable resources? Who's giving you moral support and who's giving you feedback? When you have that kind of support structure around you, it naturally allows you to be more bold in everything you do. So can't do it alone.
So is it easier in a corporate culture? Many large Indian conglomerates, they have a legacy style of functioning, Professor. It borders on bureaucracy even. There is a hierarchical style of decision making. A lot of caution is built into any kind of decision making. The families sometimes control boards as well. And there are risk-averse senior executives who almost always toe the line. Now, you've got the group level C's in your book. And like I started out saying, those are clan, charisma, and culture. So how do you shift a culture of a business group? How do you move it from risk avoidance to a calculated kind of boldness? If you can share a mini case, maybe even hypothetical, of how that could see the group C's work as per your book in a typical Indian corporate culture.
So, first of all, I think it's important to step back for a second here. What is happening in the world around us? Right? What's happening in the world around us is we have much more uncertainty in the world around us. In fact, see, in a recent study, in earnings calls of public companies in the US, CEOs use the word uncertainty 3 times more than they did the previous year. This word is out there. What is uncertainty? It's not the same as risk. Risk is where you know the distribution of outcomes. Uncertainty is where I don't know. Now, what does the human brain do to process uncertainty? It naturally gravitates towards fear. That's the primal human emotion hardwired in the human brain. And when we encounter fear, we tend to freeze or flight, not fight. It's not fight or flight. So the human condition is such that we are hardwired to freeze typically in the face of fear, which activates when there is uncertainty. And we have lots of uncertainty today. So the natural human instinct will be to freeze. But I think what we need to understand, and Peter Drucker said this 50 years ago, that organizations fail when the environment around them changes and they don't change. And I think we are in a unique moment today where we have technological uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, we have economic uncertainty, and so many more forms of uncertainty. This is when winners or losers happen. This is where market inflection points happen. And so I think it's important for boards and leaders, for everyone to understand, this is your moment to step up. And either you'll do it or you're going to get left behind. And if you're going to do it, I'll give you an example of this.
Sure.
I'm just finishing a case on a company called Boston Scientific. Boston Scientific in 2011 had done an acquisition to grow their business into a whole new terrain, and they had acquired a company called Guidant. This turned out to be the second worst acquisition in modern history. They were a $27 billion company, bought a $28 billion company. Together should have been at least $55 billion. In a couple of years, they were down to $4 billion. That is why it's the second worst acquisition since AOL Time Warner. In comes a new CEO, Mike Mahoney. Before he took the job, he was actually advised by a consulting firm, do not take this job, this company is failing. Yet he took the job. And what you find interesting over here is, today that company is a $155 billion company. And what did he do? He did all the things you would expect: fix the strategy, fix the organization, fix the culture, fix the people, fix the processes, globalize the business. He also did 52 more acquisitions in 10 years with an M&A playbook that was codified. But when I asked him, like, what's the underlying theme behind all these things you did? He said, one of the first things I had to do was infuse in our organization a winning spirit.
Right.
We lost in ourselves the confidence and capacity to win. We couldn't even imagine ourselves as winners. We were a bunch of losers. So, and how do you kind of infuse that? And by the way, this comes from sports. There's a lot of work on sports where coaches, great coaches, come in and create in the team a capacity to win. Watch Ted Lasso if you don't want to watch sports, but it's all over.
No, definitely in sports. But Professor, often when you talk about being bold, it so easily gets conflated with being reckless, especially in India, where leverage has hurt some firms as well, where, board governance is uneven, sometimes where investor expectations are so high. So then you have those regulatory scrutinies which become intense in that kind of scenario. So in your framework that you've got in your book, how does that help differentiate, smart boldness versus what some would consider foolhardy, that kind of boldness?
Excellent question. And I think it's a very pertinent question to be asking. And by the way, one of the oldest essays that I could find was on courage was going back to Aristotle.
Yes.
And Aristotle, when he made the scale explaining courage, on one extreme was cowardice, on the other extreme was reckless. And he put courage in the middle of it. So courage is now, there's a fine line between courage and reckless. So let's be very clear also, there's no definitive, this is courageous, this is reckless. And by the way, we are very convenient. If it works out, we say courageous. If it doesn't work out, we say reckless.
So we are only bold in hindsight sometimes, Professor.
Absolutely hindsight bias over here.
Yes.
But you need to learn to operate on that edge where you're understanding that this is unknown, uncharted territory. So that's why comprehension is key, where you make small bets, where you take exploratory forays. So if I look at the companies that are really being systematic and thoughtful about AI, as one example of that, they're taking one step at a time into this arena. If you're trying to change your career and take a bold move,
yes,
you take small steps into that arena, right? So you start to try to understand the domain you're working into rather than leap into it. We call it hedging.
Correct.
You might call it kind of exploratory forays. So I think it's very important to understand that bold action doesn't mean necessarily leaping into the unknown, unless you're forced to. There are crisis moments where I studied where people had no choice. They had no time or the luxury to say, I'll do this slowly at a time.
Right.
And then in those instances, you have to make a call.
So that's what, making that call is so essential, because it is a pivot that you may be making. You think you're doing a step by step, but to others, it may seem like a bold pivot. So it's also from which perspective you're coming in from. For a business that is expanding into a new region, they're adopting a new tech stack, for example, or investors are balking because the short-term metrics, they're not the most promising. In that case, what would you advise the founder, the board, about commitment and culture and boldness, at least in that particular context, when you're trying to make a pivot because something is not working out?
So look, I think the first thing to acknowledge and understand is that it's going to be normal to experience fear. I think we need to first normalize fear in our mind. It's scary. We don't know what to do. We don't know where this is going. We don't know if this is going to work out. This is scary stuff. So just putting it on the table. When you name it, you can tame it, as we say.
Correct.
Right? The next step is to then say, okay, how do we create boundary conditions around this risk or in this context? What are the worst case scenarios? You will do a scenario plan. You do Monte Carlo simulations. You figure out how to create some boundary conditions around the scenarios you're working out of what is going to play out. You also need to recognize that there are always going to be naysayers. There are always those who see more downside than upside. They don't see the upside. And organizations are designed to have people like that. So you're going to have to. This is not going to come naturally or easily. Established organizations don't take bold bets easily. It just is not what they're made of. Unless there are very few. Like one of the companies I studied was Netflix.
Right.
In Netflix, The reason they were able to make so many pivots over a relatively short period of time, and then later when Disney, Amazon, and others came head on against them, they still fought them off. It's because they baked this into their culture.
Yes.
Culture of change, a culture of challenge, experimentation, failure, learning. They called it freedom with responsibility, context not control, loosely coupled, tightly aligned. They really try to focus on this idea that we are an organization that is designed to change. Most organizations are not designed for change. Change has to be imposed on them.
So the culture, yes, indeed. But this culture of change, Professor, can it happen at a national level? I talked to you about India, which is at a moment where bold reforms in areas like digital infrastructure or energy transition, manufacturing incentives, liberalizing several sectors that have been controlled by the government in a legacy kind of way. All of these reforms could leapfrog the economy. And we're talking about a Viksit Bharat, a target set for 2047. And yet there are systems that may be clogged by inertia for one. Tell us how you would advise a policymaker in India or a reform team even. I mean, what does boldness look like when it is on top of the agenda at the national level, at the center, where bold moves can affect so many, some in good ways, some not so good? How do we ensure it doesn't backfire? Meaning like trying to be bold and then get bogged down by the battlefront you may have opened, which wasn't earlier.
So I'm not an expert in speaking about national policy, but I want to just tell you one idea that I've seen inside organizations.
Yes.
Right? Whenever you want to bring about massive change at a systemic level in an organization, the points of resistance are usually the powerful people in the organization because they have the most to lose.
Right.
So what ends up happening is that inside an organization, the power structure, you call the most powerful people together and say, let's do system change in our company.
Okay.
Or in our holding company. And guess what all the system leaders say? They don't want to change it because it upsets the very delicate balance of power that is existing. So you have to be willing to understand the power structure.
Yes.
Understand how to make change, make them understand the change, and make it in their interest to also embrace that change. I do want to say that the way that I would say look at change is to recognize that change brings upside and downside. And it's entirely up to you to decide if you want to be on that upside.
Right.
And it's really up to you to decide if I'm going to play offense or I'm going to play defense.
Right.
And I'll just give you one simple example of this to illustrate the point. I did a research study published in Harvard Business Review in about 2010 with two of my co-authors. We looked at what do companies do in down markets. Now you may say nothing to do with the question being asked, but it does. Because what you discover is down markets is where everybody talks about saying best time to get ahead of competition is down markets, but actually they all go into cost cutting in down markets. So that was my interest. And I found that I got data going back 3 recessions, and I found that the companies that invest for growth in down markets come out like winners at the end of the story. But I also found that only 9% of companies do that. The vast majority of us succumb to our fear. Back to what I was saying earlier. Fear is such a powerful human emotion that is hardwired in the primitive brain. We give in to our fear. And I think it's important to understand that change naturally taps into fear. And the question is, how are we going to overcome this very basic primal human emotion?
Yes,
And I think
overcoming.
at a system level or individual level?
Yes, indeed. So it's a primal kind of emotion, and how we're going to overcome it is something that your book talks about at length, and it gives you ways to do it. But Professor, those were the long answers. How about some very short ones in a rapid fire? Professor, just the first thought we'll do over here. Boldness in India today. If you had to pick one, bold M&A move in India or bold organic innovation, what would you pick?
I always pick organic innovation because if you do organic innovation, you can do better M&A.
And of the 9 C's that you put out, if an Indian leader must pick one to focus on for the year 2026, which one would you pick?
Confidence.
Why confidence? A quick one?
Because I think we need to believe that we can be a global technology leader, paving the way forward, not just a laggard and a follower.
Professor, can I push you to name one Indian startup or a scale-up you believe is doing boldness well, that is publicly observable as well?
I'm actually writing, I just written a case on two actually. One was called Ixigo, which you know is an online mobile travel agency which does train and bus along with air travel as well.
Yes.
Which went through multiple near failures. And I'm just finishing a case on InMobi and their spin out called Glance, which is also looking at kind of images coming to your mobile phone on your lock screen.
Right.
And you see these companies trying to say that how do we be on the frontier of our industry?
Right.
Not just West followers, but actually really pioneering things that I think the world would want to look at.
Indeed. And the biggest myth, Professor, about boldness in business that you would like to bust in India?
As I said, I think the biggest myth about boldness is that boldness is absence of fear. And that boldness is the same as reckless.
Right. That's a myth.
Yeah.
Being bold is not being reckless. And a young Indian employee who's watching us, who wants to bring bold change in the organization he or she is working for in the next 12 months, what's your one piece of advice to her or him?
Do something that scares you. Just try to find what it is and see how you can build a relationship with fear. Fear is normal. Fear is natural. You're going to experience it every day of our lives. How do we build a relation? How do we learn not to succumb to fear, but to tame fear, to bypass fear, short-circuit fear, even outwit fear? You can go back to the Bhagavad Gita also, and there you have Arjuna and Krishna sitting over there. And, you know, we have heard so many stories about people being scared, fearful, doubtful. How do we learn to engage with fear? That is my biggest suggestion to everybody.
That's excellent. The takeaways are enormous. We could carry on this conversation, Professor, but that's where we'll have to leave it for paucity of time. But Professor Gulati, thank you so much for this very insightful conversation from London to Mumbai. It's been a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. You asked me some great questions.
Thank you, Professor. And to viewers, thank you for joining us on Profit Insights. If there's one takeaway for me, it's that boldness is not just for the headline-grabbing CEO or even the high-flying startup. It is something that each of us can cultivate. So stay bold. I'm Vikram Oza. Thank you for joining us on Profit Insights.